So by a show of hands, how many people here have heard of the ultra deep field experiment by the Hubble telescope? Okay, very few. Okay, well, strap in, because I'm glad I get to tell you about this. What happened some years ago was that NASA had completed a low-resolution map of the night sky, and they decided that they wanted to go deeper. So they picked a little tiny patch of space, a patch of space that's about the size of a pencil tip at arm's length. And it was black. There was nothing there. And what they decided they would do is point the finely honed lens of the Hubble telescope at that little patch of space. So every time the Hubble came around the Earth, they pointed the telescope at that little patch to see if they could capture any photons and see if there was actually something in there that was too dim to see normally. So every time the Hubble came around the Earth, they pointed it for 20 minutes, and they pulled this trick off 400 times. And at the end of that, they compiled all the information, they collected all the lonely photons that had trickled in from distant reaches of the universe, and they put it together, and they found that there was something in that little patch of space after all. And it wasn't a star, and it wasn't a cluster of stars. It was 10,000 galaxies. Now, a galaxy is 100 billion stars. So we're talking 1,000 trillion stars in this little patch of space. Each one of those stars, just like our sun, many of them presumably with planetary systems around them, all of them with the potential to house unknown forms of biology. Right? So I think this is a good consciousness raiser to think about the size of the mysteries that surround us. So I am a scientist. I've devoted my entire life to science because I figure if we want to understand what's going on in this strange world around us, there's probably no better method than to directly study the blueprints. And science in the last 400 years has been tremendously successful. We have cured smallpox and polio and gotten men to the moon and made the internet and tripled lifespans. But I think what you really get from a life in science is this knowledge that after you walk the pier of everything that we know in science, at some point you reach the end of the pier. And beyond the end is everything that we don't know. It's all the uncharted waters, the deep mysteries that we don't have insight into yet, like why mass and energy are equivalent, or what dark matter and dark energy are, or why there are multiple spatial dimensions, or how you build consciousness from mechanical pieces and parts. That's the real lesson that you get from science, is about the vastness of our ignorance. Now, I have no doubt that every generation we will continue to add a few more slats to the pier, but it's a huge ocean, and we don't really have any guarantee how far we'll get, and certainly in our brief twinkling of a 21st century lifetime, we're not going to get to the end of that. And so the lesson that you get from science is that what we know is so vastly outstripped by what we don't know. So given that situation, I have been interested in what has happened this last decade with the books by the neo-atheists. And these books are some of my favorite books, and they're very important and insightful books. But what's been interesting to me is the public reaction to them, because what they have led to, as far as I can see, is something of a misconception widely, that scientists don't have the capacity to gamble beyond the available data. And that scientists are acting as though we've got it all figured out. We understand it, F equals ma, E equals mc squared. We can put it in equations, or if we can't yet, then we're pretty close, and it should suffice to capture a description of the whole cosmos. I think that's actually not a very good description of how science actually operates. Ben's right when he said that science is about disproving other people's hypotheses, but it's about so much more than that. Science is really about this creativity of making up new hypotheses. And there's part of the scientific temperament is this tolerance for holding multiple hypotheses in mind at the same time. Now, what we actually do is we make up new stories in the laboratory every day, and then we go and we seek evidence. We gather evidence to weigh in favor of some stories over others. But it's often the case that some questions are too far out right now. They're beyond the toolbox of science, and as a result, we're unable to gather evidence for them. And in that situation, it's okay. Science is comfortable holding multiple hypotheses on the table. That ambiguity is accepted as part of the relationship we have with Mother Nature. It's part of the vast mysteries around us. We have to have that ambiguity. So I don't pretend like we've got it all figured out. And as a result, I have felt sometimes that perhaps we know too little to commit to a position of strict atheism. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we know way too much to commit to any particular religious story, right? So there are 2,000 religions on the globe, and it's been pointed out by others that everyone already knows what it's like to be an atheist, because all you need to do is look at someone else's religion, and you say, well, that's patently ridiculous that you would believe in that. And of course, they're looking back at you and thinking the same thing. Now, the holy books written by the world's religions are often quite beautiful, and they crystallize hard-won wisdom. But in fact, these were written millennia ago by people who didn't know about the size of the cosmos or the Big Bang or bacterial infection or DNA or computation or even very much about neighboring landscapes and cultures. So whenever I'm sitting next to somebody on an airplane, I ask everybody if they've ever heard of the Ultra Deep Field experiment by the Hubble telescope. So far, nobody's heard of that. But everybody's able to tell me all of the details of whatever cultural story they grew up on. And you don't need to be an anthropologist to recognize that our nervous systems absorb whatever our cultures pour into us. So if you grow up in Saudi Arabia, you're going to love Islam. And if you're born in Rome, you'll love Catholicism and Tel Aviv Judaism and Springfield, Ohio, Protestantism. And it's not a coincidence that there's not a blossoming of Islam in Springfield, Ohio, and there's not a blossoming of Protestantism in Mecca. It's because we're products of our culture. We accept whatever is poured into us, right? If there were one truth, you would expect that it would spread everywhere evenly, but clearly the data doesn't support that. The crazy part is our cultures pour this stuff into us, and then sometimes people are willing to fight and die over the particular stories. Ralph Waldo Emerson pointed out a while ago that the religious stories of one generation become the literary entertainment of the next generation. And you can see that nobody's fighting over Isis and Osiris anymore, or the Greek and Roman panoplies. Not so much. And so I want to give you an example of this. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the creation story of the Bakuba kingdom in the Congo, but their creation story goes like this. There was a white giant named Mombo who had a sharp pain in his belly, and he vomited up the earth and the sun and the moon and the stars. I'm not making this up. And then he had a second pain, and he vomited up the animals and people and trees. And included in that second ejection was, and I quote, the leopard, the anvil, the eagle, woman, the monkey fumu, firmament, medicine, man, and lightning. Now, if you find the creation story of the Bakuba an unlikely explanation for how we got here, just keep in mind that if you were Bakuba, you would find equally bizarre the Western story of the naked couple and the talking reptile and the prohibited produce. And if you were Bakuba living in Kansas, you would be fighting to get this in your children's textbooks. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Bakuba story is wrong or the Adam and Eve story are wrong because there are competing stories. I'm suggesting they're wrong because all the available evidence we can gather weighs against them. So, for example, the biblical story suggests that the Earth is 6,000 years old. Our best science tells us that it's 4.5 billion years old. So that means the biblical account has to somehow explain how the Japanese were making pottery 4,000 years before the Earth existed. So for my money, this puts me somewhere in the middle. I have felt for a long time that we know too little to commit to strict atheism, and we know far too much to commit to a particular religious story. So what has surprised me is the amount of certainty that I find out there. So when you walk into a bookstore, what you find are the books by the neo-atheists and the books by the fundamentally religious, and they argue with each other, and they polarize each other, and they're spending all of their energies on that. And it has felt to me for a while like maybe there should be another voice here, because that seems too limited for a modern discussion. Because if you think about the space of possibilities, right? So take the whole Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, that's one point in the possibility space. Take the Eastern religions. That's another point. Take the idea that we're mechanical pieces and parts and we shut off when we die. That's another point. We were planted here by space aliens. Take another point, right? When you start populating the space, what you realize is there are vast landscapes in between of possibilities. And all of these points are infinitesimally unlikely, right? But together they add up to this possibility space. And I feel like there's not really enough discussion about that space. Instead, the whole discussion has been limited to what I consider perhaps a false dichotomy, this God versus no God, and that's where the conversation has ended. Now, some people in the middle position, sometimes people use the term agnostic. I don't use that term because the way I see it used, it typically is used as a weak term. Often when people say they're agnostic, what they mean is, I'm not sure whether the guy with the beard on the cloud exists or doesn't exist, right? So I don't call myself an agnostic. I call myself a possibilian. And the idea with possibilianism is an active exploration of new ideas and a comfort with the scientific temperament of creativity and holding multiple hypotheses in mind. So possibilianism is now 18 months old. And I first announced it when I was on a live national interview on NPR. I explained it and I defined it. And when I got done with the interview, I got back in my truck and I drove over to my laboratory at Baylor College of Medicine, where I'm a neuroscientist. And I settled in for a day of work and I opened up my email and I had hundreds of emails from people. And they all said, hey, I think I'm a possibilian too. So I thought that was pretty cool. So I Googled the word and it turns out the word didn't exist. There were 0 hits. So I did what anybody would do. I bought Possibilian.com. And then I waited to see what would happen. Well, what happened has been amazing. What happened is groups started popping up all over the place. On Facebook, Possibilian groups got started. The New York Times did an article on it. MSNBC did an article on it. It spread worldwide. The Uganda Times just had a beautiful piece on possibilianism. The India Sunday Times. There are now 15,000 Google hits. And it's really caught fire. One thing I noticed that was funny is people who had heard about it on the radio didn't always know how to spell it, or they forgot the name, and so people started calling it possibilitarian also, and all kinds of things, and spelling it every way you could imagine. And I thought, you know what? That's perfect. That's right in the possibilian spirit. Spell it however you want to do it. But the question I started wondering about is why? What is the reason that this movement is catching on, given that it's a very strange movement in that we don't subscribe to anything? So it struck me that maybe what's going on, now that we've passed the first decade of this millennium, I think maybe people are a little bit tired of people acting as though they're certain about things that they can't possibly be certain about. So they're a little tired of the debates between Dawkins versus the Discovery Institute. And as Voltaire said, uncertainty is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd position. So I want to make 2 points of clarification about possibilianism. So one is, sometimes people come up to me after a talk and they say, that's terrific that you're a possibilian, and I'm so glad that anything goes in possibilianism because that means you get me in terms of ESP and crystals and whatever. No. Possibilianism is not anything goes. It's anything goes at first. And then we import the tools of science to rule out parts of the possibility space. So it would be terrific if ESP existed. We would all love that. But to the extent that we can measure things now, we cannot find any evidence to support it. And so the idea is you import the tools to sculpt, to structure the possibility space. You can rule out whole areas. And the interesting part of possibilianism really picks up where the toolbox of science leaves out. It's where we no longer have the tools to address it, and we have to understand the space of possibilities. That's where it's really important. And the reason it is so important to keep that open-mindedness about all the parts we don't know is because we know for certain about the magnitude of things that we don't know. So in every generation of scientists, people have always felt that they have all the pieces and parts that they need in order to answer what's going on around them in the cosmos. But just imagine trying to explain the northern lights in the absence of understanding the magnetosphere, or trying to explain the heart before the concept of a pump was invented, or trying to understand how muscles work before electricity is discovered. You would make theories, but you would be doomed to be incorrect. Well, we're in that same position now. So we've got Newtonian physics and Einsteinian physics and quantum mechanics, and we think, okay, we've sort of got all the pieces and parts. But on the one hand, there's all the unknown unknowns, all the stuff we don't even know we don't know. But what I want to emphasize is all the stuff that we know for sure we don't know. So take something like dark matter, right? So astrophysicists look at the movement of the planets and the galaxies, and they look at how everything's moving around, and they look at the gravitational pull. And what they realize is something's missing. There's something out there that we can't quite see or smell or touch, but it must be there to make the equations work out, to make the movements in the cosmos explain. And so we're going to call this a fudge factor, and we're going to call it dark matter. And the idea is that dark matter is the thing that we don't exactly know what it is, but we require it to make the equations work out. Okay. Some of you may already know, dark matter is not a tiny fudge factor. 90% of the known universe is what we call dark matter. That's a lot to sweep under the rug. Okay, and this is what I study. I go in the lab every day and study the human brain. This is the most complicated device we have ever found in the universe. It's essentially an alien kind of computational material. And it is so dense in its connectivity that if you were to take a cubic millimeter of brain tissue, there are more connections in there than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So this is incredibly complex. And yet somehow this wet mechanical network system here is you. It's all your hopes and dreams and aspirations. Right? Somehow that's you. If you were to lose a little part of your pinky, you wouldn't be any different. But if you lose an equivalently sized piece of neural tissue, that completely changes your conscious state, right? Well, the problem is we don't know how to take mechanical pieces and parts and build private subjective experience out of that. Imagine that I give you 1 trillion Tinker Toys, and I said, okay, hook it up. So this is a lever, and this touches that, and that causes that, and so on. At what point do you add one more Tinker Toy, and then you say, it's experiencing the taste of feta cheese now? Right? That's the problem. We don't know. We don't have any way to take our equations and say, okay, well, just carry the two and do a triple integral, and then that's feta cheese, or that's the redness of red, or the qualia of pain, or something. We don't. Not only do we not have a theory of how the brain works, we don't even know what such a theory would look like. Okay, so all of this calls for a bit of intellectual humility. Now, I was giving this talk recently, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, hey, Dr. Eagleman, good job on the talk. He said, you know what? I think you should become a politician because you're unwilling to commit to anything. And he said to me, why don't you just cowboy up and commit to something? So I thought about that. So in Texas, where I come from, we have this lovely expression, to cowboy up. And what it means is to firmly commit to a decision. And we really value this trait in people. We like people who can firmly commit to a decision. So if you're trying to decide, should I take the cattle out in the rain, or should I marry this woman, or should I sell the ranch, we like people who can make a really firm decision. But what I'm going to suggest is that there are some domains where it's appropriate to cowboy up, and there are some domains where it's not so appropriate. So would you stop a guy on a ranch and say, tell me, if you think there are extraterrestrial civilizations, do you care what his opinion is? Would you value it more than, say, an astrobiologist? And if you wouldn't ask him about extraterrestrial civilizations, that suggests that there are some domains in which it is not appropriate to commit and act like you know the answer in the absence of having good evidence. So the next time someone says to you to cowboy up and commit to a decision, I suggest that you tell them, no, I would rather geek out. And the idea of geeking out is having a creativity for new narratives and a comfort level with holding multiple possibilities in mind. And you should feel free to cite the gospel of science, the most important 3 words that science ever gave to humankind. So my message to you is this. when you leave here and you go back out into this strange world, try to seek comfort with having multiple narratives and uncertainty. And this is not just a plea for simple open-mindedness, but for an active exploration of new ideas. I think this is important for our education, for our legislation, for perhaps the future of our warfare. So when you leave Pop Tech full of ideas, go back and look around the strange world you're in and see if you can live a life that is free from dogma and full of awe and wonder. And see if you can celebrate possibility and praise uncertainty. Thank you very much.